Hi, everybody, and welcome to Replenish Earth Live Speaker Series, where we explore climate action through innovative and exciting speakers. And boy, have we got someone special for you today. Today marks the fourth day of London Climate Action Week, where we drive the national and international climate policy response to prioritising green recovery. We'll be exploring four themes this week: a green, fair, resilient recovery, a roadmap to COP26, sustainable and net zero London, and whole society climate mobilization. I'm Tia Kansara, and today we're going to be hosting Moran Cerf, professor, who is amongst the 40 leading professors below 40, holds multiple patents and has published over 60 academic papers in journals such as Nature, the Journal of Neuroscience, and more, and portrayed in popular media outlets such as Wired, Scientific American, BBC, CNN, The Atlantic, Times, Forbes. Prior to his academic career, Professor Cerf worked as a hacker in the cybersecurity industry and currently is on the board of a number of tech companies and is the co-founder of Think Alike and B-Cube. Importantly, he's not left-handed. And that's an interesting fact about you, isn't it? Welcome, Moran.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, same. I think it's an intriguing bridge between hacking and hacking in the tech sphere and then hacking of the human sort of neuroscientist type methodology that really links into this kind of questioning and delving and exploring and testing.
The world is full of black boxes.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Tell us a little bit more about what you're up to at the moment. And how did you even make that leap? I mean, there you are telling us stories of how you hacked into a bank. We watched that one. And there comes this opportunity to teach people how to hack.
So I would say at the that people usually tell their story backwards. They end up somewhere and they find a way to tell a story how all their lives they ended up working towards this goal as if there's some kind of plan. Same for me. I probably ended up where I am and now can kind of connect the dots somehow looking back. But I think being a hacker did involve a lot of knowledge on how to look into black boxes and figure out what's going on inside by just observing their actions. This was how we broke into banks and how we broke into leading governments. And I think that when you look at the brain, it kind of operates in the same way. It's a black box. We can control the input and see the output, but we don't really know how things work out on the in. And at some point, the methods, whether it's statistics or computer science, whether it's kind of creating experiments that tell you something about how to change things, work the same way. For me specifically, there was always the kind of story component, which is I met a famous scientist who basically learned that I'm a hacker and said, what are you wasting your time breaking into banks? If you're a hacker and there's so few of you guys, you should do the most interesting thing in the world and hack into our brain, and basically gave me a recommendation letter. And with that, I could go to school and start my career.
Wow, that's incredible. Because there's, breaking that down, there's sensation, there's perception, then there's behavior. There's the sensation of what it would feel like to actually use the knowledge that you have, perceiving what you could do, and then changing your behavior. And, it's interesting that, from your experience, of course, in the social context of the way in which we use these sorts of sensations in creating certain behaviors is obviously an element of positive reinforcement, which, of course, the professor had given to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you broke it right. I think people many times combine the sensation and the perception or the entire thing into like I did it without realizing that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it later, but that there are some differences between kind of what actually is reality, how we perceive reality, our sampling of reality, and kind of what we make of that as this probably is that thing that we saw, which isn't the same. So there is maybe one thing and we kind of take only a sample of that. And then what it makes us do is a third thing. And I think to understand this thing allows you to enhance your perception. You can suddenly see more, to understand what you're missing, and then to change your behavior. And I think that this was kind of vague, but to make it a little bit more concrete, first of all, I would say that a lot of spiritual world experiments are all about that. Like if you go to any of the spiritual guidance kind of world, they basically try to teach you the separation between the world and what you perceive. That's kind of like a classic 101 in any meditation course that you take. And I think that a lot of therapy is about taking your perception and leading it to changing behavior. And I think that those are concrete things that people can use.
Yeah, it's kind of as if like taking your example of the actual spiritual world, there's an element of sensory sort of education there, the kind of immersive education there. Even when you're meditating, you're sort of like immersing yourself within yourself, if one would even call that an immersion. But you are going in, and that is the immersive experience. And one is required to sort of change these sorts of habits. If you are never meditating, and if you've never sort of snipped away from your own perception of what reality is, how can you enter another?
If I will wear for a second my more neuroscience professor hat, I would say that one thing that people miss and is important to understand is that most of what we experience as the world comes from within. Our eyes and our nose and our ears, they give us sample of the outside world, and this fits into a system inside our brain that kind of creates reality and says, change your internal image to this because I got new input. And I'll give you a concrete example that would be in the form of a story that makes it clear. Back in the days when the prison Alcatraz in San Francisco was big, where all the worst people on earth were in one place, if you behaved badly in Alcatraz, if you did something within the prison that was bad, you would be given the worst punishment. And the worst punishment was solitary confinement. So think about it. You're surrounded by the worst people on earth, and still being taken away from them and being put alone with your own brain is regarded a punishment that's worse. Like instead of seeing people, you'd be by yourself. And what happened to those prisoners, and there's now records of people reporting from the prison after being sent to solitary confinement for sometimes days and days. So they were there for a while without seeing daylight, without seeing other humans, without basically interacting with anyone. They only given food 3 times a day in a little tray. And these people report something interesting, which is after a couple of days, they kind of lose sense of time. They don't know if they slept 6 hours or an entire night, and they don't know if it's daytime. They don't know how long it's passed. And what happens is that their brain starts manufacturing realities. So they said, suddenly there was another person in my cell with me. And suddenly I saw myself in a different place. And they start kind of reporting, and they know that it's impossible, but the illusions are so real that basically they hallucinated something that they thought was happening, and it was hard for them to come back because their brain started saying, okay, I'm not getting any input from the outside world. I guess I'm going to have to let what I manufacture from within materialize. And they started really seeing people and hearing voices. And for them, it felt as real as if someone is in the room. It's just because the brain doesn't like not getting any input. And in the absence of it, it creates one.
Do you think that's some level of like DMT release in the body?
So I think it's a mechanism so our brain, if you think kind of what's the purpose of our brain, and we started way into philosophy on the first panel, is the brain is supposed to kind of be the machine that nature gave us to keep evolving and changing and adapting to the environment after we're born. Everything else in our body is fixed. Our genes are fixed. Like we know what color your hair is going to be as soon as you're born. It's written somewhere. You can't change that unless you manufacture changes in your genes. So nature gave us one organ that will keep adapting and evolving even after we're born. That's the brain. And for that to happen, the brain needs to interact with the environment. The brain wants to get information and keep processing and changing. And if you deprive it from that, if you tell the brain, no, you're going to basically act like you're, you're a heart. You're not going to get any changes from the environment. All you're going to do is you're doing the same thing that you do all the time. Then the brain kind of starts freaking out. And in response, it just creates its own reality. It's just keep processing.
What kind of like education, sensory, immersive experiences can we do? Can we create? Can we share to change the habits of people? Because ultimately, if that is such an immersive internal relationship, all of our senses are, what it's basically like having, a TV screen, but behind, you've got everything wired up. You can see where everything is sort of like emerging, and neurologically it's my sort of mainframe, right? Like inside my body is this connective device all across my spine that like really brings everything into relationship with the brain and how my body sort of interacts with it. So if we're changing the habits of people, how much of that is really even an external cue rather than it being an internal response to the cue?
So this is a lot to unpack, but let's do it in a relatively concrete way. So the point of habits, the reason they exist, is that sometimes the brains try to optimize behaviors. So if you drive to work every day, then it's a 30 minutes drive from home to work. and you take that same route every day. So at some point after day 3 or 4, your brain kind of says, okay, I'm taking the same route right now. Instead of me having to pay full attention and focus on this route and kind of really be in the moment, I'm going to code that in a part of the brain that will basically work automatically. So you leave home and you start driving, and you still get input and you still respond to them, but in a way it doesn't pass to conscious awareness fully. Like you kind of get samples of this, but you mostly do it without paying attention. This frees your brain to spend time thinking about things you want to do, maybe kind of listen to the radio while driving and pay attention to the radio. So it allows you to do it. And this is on a kind of grand scheme of thing, a system that our brain wants to do all the time. Every time you repeat things enough time, the brain says, okay, now I got it. We always do the same thing. Let's kind of put it in the back in an automatic system that will do it for us. Now, if you want to break it, the easiest way to do it is to kind of deviate mechanically from that. This will force your brain to pay attention. So what I tell my students sometimes in different contexts, but in the context of how to kind of be more in the zone, I tell them, drive differently to work every day. So just take a different route. This forces your brain to actually pay attention, because you now have to make decisions all the time. You have to kind of be in the moment and see, am I taking a right turn? Like you kind of have to create a map. If instead of going from here, I'm going from here. Am I still in the same kind of direction? So this forces your brain to kind of get information out of the habit world into the kind of experience world. And it would mean that you would pay more attention. It means that time would be more realistic. Like when you work with habits, you don't pay attention to time. So sometimes like driving to work feels like 1 minute because you weren't really there. When you're driving, you pay attention to all the steps, you will know all the moments. It creates more memories. There's a lot of good things about that, but I should say, just as a final sentence here, that it's not a good and bad thing. Like habits are good and not having habits is good. So based on the need, you choose kind of what do you want to automate and let your brain do without you being aware of, and what things you want to break. And that's something that people can choose for themselves. And sometimes it's good to be in here or in there.
Yeah, totally. I think in terms of the education of living in harmony with nature, or the climate action that we're doing this week, bringing people closer towards understanding and appreciating climate emergencies. I was just thinking in terms of like, are there certain senses that people can interact with better? So is that sort of habit shift much more applicable when you can smell it rather than you can see it, or whether you can touch it? Are there certain senses that are dominant over others?
So that's bringing us to an interesting idea that kind of is changing and shifting right now among neuroscientists. Among the population, if you ask people kind of to rank their senses, let's say there's 5. We have a little bit more than 5, but let's kind of talk about the 5 that are very kind of classical ones, like sound, sight, olfaction, taste, and so on. And you ask them to rank them, like what's most important? Which ones would you not want to lose if you had to kind of lose a sense? People usually put vision at the top and smells at the bottom. They kind of say, I really, like, if I could not see, this would totally take a lot of my experience in the world. So this was the most important one for me. And if I had to lose my sense of smell, okay, I'll do without it. It seems to be that humans kind of are thinking like that because we have really good sight. We see far into the distance and our eyes can focus very good and we can see a lot of color. So a lot of things came to us. And also our eyes are at the top of our body, so we see from high above, and our noses are also there. Like most of the smells are down on the ground, and we're not there to smell them. So part of like just using the nose correctly would be to go down to the ground and just smell what's out there. You will actually realize that you're much better in sensing smell than you think you are. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because we have more and more evidence from the last couple of years that a sense of smell in humans is actually critical. It's just that it's not really passing through consciousness. There's a chance here that you chose your partner because of how they smell, and you would tell yourself, okay, well, I actually like their sense of humor, and you're going to find all kinds of reasons cognitively that you're going to make up. But there's more and more evidence that if you look at the kind of immune system of your body and the immune system of their body, and you kind of mix them, you see that the offsprings are going to be stronger wise. That they identify them. Like if I give you 10 t-shirts with the smell of your partner on one of them and 900 people, you would actually pick out without knowing the right one. So it seems that the sense of smell is critical to how we are. And what's interesting there is that most of nature operates with odors. We're among the few animals that we use as sight as a key reception organ. Most animals use smell primarily. You can turn the lights off in a room and the rats would still navigate the maze perfectly because they can navigate with their sense of smell. Your puppy finds things with the sense of smell and leaves marks in odors for other puppies to find her. So kind of nature works like that. And of course, like trees and mushrooms, they all release odors. So all of nature operates with one sense. And we decided that we're going to use another one. And we decided that this one is much better. Now, there are loads and loads of research on like the advantages of each smell and how they work in concert. And it's not that you have to kind of choose one and that's it, that's the one. But I think that humans kind of went all the way to saying, this one is the useless one. And turns out it's probably really critical to our survival. Wow. And I'll say one more thing. It's kind of interesting to think about in the context of kind of isolation right now that everyone is in, that one of the things you lose first when you get the coronavirus is the sense of smell. And suddenly people realize like kind of the importance. And it's also critical when it comes to realizing that one of the things that we stopped doing is touching each other. And there are studies that show that the touching of another person, physically rubbing ourselves onto them, actually creates kind of a chemistry between us that we smell. There's a famous study. I'm going to tangent, but I'm going to finish in one idea that this study kind of breaks people to the lab and tell them this is going to be a smell study. Someone comes to the lab, someone else shakes their hands, gives them a cup of tea, has them to sit down and tell them, we're going to collect you in a few minutes to start the study. And then they wait in the lobby. And this is a lie because the study already happened. It's in the lobby. It's not that you're waiting to participate. The study was all in the handshake that you were given when you came, because what they did is they kind of shook the hand of a person who came and they waited and they filmed them in the lobby. What they show is that while people wait for the study to begin, most of them take the hand that they were shaken and kind of brings them close to the nose, and they don't do this, but it's kind of bringing it close, and it's really controlled well. So if you're a heterosexual female and another woman comes and shakes your hand, you don't do it. But if a male comes, you don't do it. You do it, sorry. If it's opposite partner sex comes, and if you're,
is that just in terms of preference?
So if you're a lesbian woman, you would do it only with the woman who shakes your hand rather than with a man. So your preference manifests in whether you, and if the person comes wears a glove and shakes your hand, you wouldn't do it. Like, so they really control all the parameters just to show that kind of inherently we know that rubbing our bodies to other bodies kind of leaves a mix of the odors, allows us to basically check, is this person going to be a good mate for me? And we don't think like that, but that's what we do when we're in the lobby waiting, without even kind of deciding to do that. All to say that now that we don't do it as much, we don't touch people as much because we're all in our own kind of hubs, we lose more than just the communication verbally. We also use something that we cannot get in Zoom. We lose the ability to actually touch.
It's almost as if the body doesn't really know the difference between an experience and a thought, right? Like the experience of something, the thinking of something, like you were talking about dreams earlier. It's as if the body almost assumes that really did happen, whether you're in absolute isolation, in a prison, or dreaming something, or or whether you're actually really whether it's really happening. It seems as if there is a sort of like change in biology or change in the neurocircuitry or chemistry or hormones to kind of like relate one to the other. The sort of the event happened sometimes creatively or physically, as if there is a sort of relationship between the two that happened without noticing it.
I think the way I think about it now, kind of combining the world of hacking with the world of neuroscience, is the brain kind of has a lot of components, a lot of modules. There's a module that is in charge of seeing. There's a module in charge of smelling. There's a module in charge of like making decisions, and they all kind of talk to each other, but they don't really see the entire world. None of them gets access to the entire world. So the part of the brain that basically makes decision gets inputs from another part and makes decisions based on that. And the part that is, let's say, seeing knows if the eyes are open or closed. So if you're seeing because your eyes are open and you're actually taking the environment, it's one seeing. And if you're dreaming and the entire vision comes from within and it's like a dream, it looks different for that part. But for the decision-making part, it looks the same. The seeing part knows that it's coming from outside or from within, but then once it creates an experience and it says decision-making part, tell me if I should go left or right in this decision, the part that makes decision doesn't know if it's a dream that we're kind of walking in or reality. And for much of the brain, there are components that actually have no idea what's the difference between a dream, a reality, being alone and making it up or imagining it versus being with people. It's not that the entire brain doesn't know. The entire brain made a lot of things, and the part that always know whether you're dreaming or awake, but for some parts of the brain, it looks the same whether you're with me right now or across the Atlantic and talking to me via Zoom.
Wow, but how can we actually even unify our understanding when it comes to these sorts of different realities? Like, how might something like AI or neuroscience mitigate these sort of discrepancies in making sense of things? As a sort of a group, we may exhibit different kinds of behaviors, or we may amplify certain things according to our individual choices or individual sort of like senses. So, like, in terms of mob behavior or climate sort of activity, how do we create these sorts of drivers that can help us amplify positive sort of behaviors rather than influence the negative ones?
So the concrete answer that scientists have been trying to kind of toy with right now is constant reminders as a way to make it work.
Right.
That kind of take you out of the experience and say, hey, kind of evaluate it. And that works to an extent. And otherwise, I would say it's really hard. I'll give you kind of an example, that mechanical one. There are people who basically suffer from a disorder in which they hallucinate someone else. So they hallucinate, they think, like kind of schizophrenia, they think that there's another person in the room with them that speaks to them. Now, everyone else tells them there isn't anyone here. It's just you and me. Let's say there's two people in the room. They say it's only two of us. And the person says, no, there's a third one here sitting, and I see them. And for the person who's under this condition, it's as real as it gets. Like, they see another person. This person comes up with ideas and thoughts. And for them, it's really hard to tell apart this person from that person. Right? For them, there's a third person in the room that it's surprising that no one else does. It's as if someone told me right now, you're talking to yourself for the last hour. And I said, no, of course, I see Tia here and we're talking. And she asked her. And someone said, no, it's only in your mind. It's very, very hard for us. So what they did for these people, as one example, there are many kind of things, but one of the things that they did is they basically said, look, whether you think this person is here or not, whether you believe it, you should just know that everyone else doesn't say it. So maybe you're kind of, you have some ability that you can see some, but at the end of the day, if you want to kind of interact with society, you have to know that no one else sees this person. So you have to regard whatever this person says and how they talk to you differently, because you're alone. And a way to use technology for that, they give them basically a bracelet. It's a very basic bracelet. All it does is it vibrates when sound comes from the outside world. So it has basically a little microphone, and when sound comes, it vibrates. So if you speak to me, it will vibrate because sound comes. But if this hallucinatory person speaks to me, it won't vibrate because there isn't sound coming. So I'm hearing it in my head, but it's not going to vibrate. So this person sits there with this wrist kind of band, and it knows that if someone spoke and it didn't vibrate, there's a chance that no one else hears this person, and then you can kind of. So this basically is a constant reminder, kind of, that constantly allows you to monitor with other parts of your brain whether this sound came or not. Now, there's some caveats to this, because if you're really high up on the level of hallucination, then you might even hallucinate that it's vibrating. Like, it won't vibrate, but your brain gonna wanna create this kind of experience. So there's a chance that so for some people it doesn't work, sometimes it works. But this is just one way, as an example, of using technology to help a person, kind of by giving them a constant reminder. So every time you hear this voice, you kind of check also, did it vibrate? Okay, now I can calibrate. And this is one way to deal with this gap between what we perceive and what's reality.
Yeah, it feels like there is some global scale of calibration, especially when it comes to influencing people, right? Like the predictability of certain behaviors, or, psychographics, or the social dilemma type things, or the great hack. When it comes to certain behaviors that require anchoring into the perceptions of people, that at least to kind of keep them up with the Joneses or whoever else. How does that even occur? So where does that anchoring even become a reality for those that have such different, we all have different realities. I'm not taking the example of those that are really at the high spectrum of hallucinations, but, in whatever the normal range of brain activity might be. How can that even be determined? Like, where do you anchor these sorts of behaviors and thoughts and understand them?
So we went into the realm of so you will find quite a few neuroscience academic papers with different arguments on where is it happening and so on. Mechanically, there are kind of parts of the brain that are critical for the alignment of reality, like part of the thalamus, and that definitely kind of creates binding of experiences that everyone agrees is critical for that. But I think that once we knew, we would have a very clear way of fixing it, and we don't. I'll give you kind of two intuitions on that, even though I should say that there's, if we had an answer, we would just fix it. We don't have a good answer. That's why you hear. So there are parts of the brain that are responsible for creating the experience of now. We always have an experience of kind of being in the present. However, being in the present is kind of a tough thing, because the present of, say, my hand is different than the present of my feet, because they're not in the same place, and the brain has to create it. So for example, if I clap my hands right now, then there was a sensation in my right hand and my left hand of touching each other. This sensation sent signals into my brain, into process information from the right and from the left, and it all went back to the same location. It said, okay, we felt those things in the same time. This was happening simultaneously. If I tapped my hand into my feet, then similarly, things had to come to the brain, but it would take longer for things to get from my feet to my brain. That's because it's farther. There's like a, I don't know, fraction of a second difference between when my hand sent signal, I felt something, to when my feet sent the signal to it. And the brain has to connect those, and even though they came up in time apart, the brain has to say, this and this are present, that they're simultaneously. So the brain basically has a mechanism that kind of waits. It feels something, and it waits a little bit for other mechanisms to come, and then it kind of binds them together and says, okay, these two that came apart actually at the same time. This part of the brain creates what we call the experience of the now, and it means that now is usually about a second and a half. For a second and a half, everything that will happen will be perceived by your brain as happening simultaneously.
Wow.
And this is kind of a bit, it's a big gap to if you're doing multiple things, like if you're in a car accident and everything happens very, very fast, to collapse everything into kind of one thing that happens simultaneously. So we can make big mistakes. And to tie it to what we said before, kind of schizophrenia, let's call it the name for this disorder where you start seeing people, one of the theories is that maybe the reason you have this kind of disorder is that there's a flaw in the mechanism that creates the now. And what it means is that sometimes things happen and you kind of mix them in different order. So for example, when you speak right now to me, there are questions that come in your head that you kind of form into the question that you ask me. So you kind of hear all kinds of conversations in your head, basically, and you articulate them and you send them out to me, and I get one question. And this part of your brain kind of orders them and stacks them in the right order as when they kind of, you ask a question of yourself, you answered, and so on. And this kind of forms what you output. If this mechanism doesn't work, then you still do the same thing, but then your brain kind of mixes them and it says, oh, maybe I got the answer before I got the question. And because the brain doesn't know how to deal with the things that come before an answer for a question, it immediately creates an entity outside that probably asked this. And you give it kind of words and you give it like a real life, because the brain now kind of solves the problem of how did I hear the answer before I asked the question? Impossible. So it must have come from someone else. And boom. So if we just fix the time in this part of the brain, we might actually fix schizophrenia by kind of aligning your brain. That's one theory that I gave you that kind of is interesting and intuitive. There are many others.
Yeah, it almost feels as if there is this schizophrenia in society where it comes to decision making, right? In understanding whether these experiences are uniform and we're all experiencing them at the same time. One of the things that as economists we work quite a lot with, especially during these times of climate action, is tragedy of the commons, the identity that we have created for the use of common resources, like the governing principles of the global commons. Mm-hmm. So what kind of, issues do we have in situations where if a common piece of the earth is misused or abused by certain parties or selfish means, right? Then there requires a behavior that sort of almost balances and or reduces that potential from harming the entire planet. So when we come to sort of planetary level advantage of these communal spaces, it's for all of us to have some level of interaction with and use of these resources as a whole, rather than a more colonial controlling mechanism to either deplete or to sort of like move everybody aside and sort of have full control of something. What kind of policies globally can aid that sort of commonality and respect for these spaces, and how might sometimes even anonymity, like no social aids or help in seeing that you have or you've gained like social favor by doing something good, or the sort of dopamine hit that you get from having posted something good on social media be the only reason for that actual shift?
So I mean, you asked a tough question with some of the answer in the question that I'll pick on. So at the kind of heart of it is, as you said, tragedy of commons leads to the fact that one mistake usually leads to a decay. So if you do something bad and we have a shared resource, then it's very hard for me now. I'm suffering from something you did. It's very hard for me to now kind of keep putting my trust in it. So usually trust kind of crumbles. And what we know from research in psychology is that trust is really hard to recover, especially on larger groups. So you can say, I'm sorry, and I can trust you again. But if the you is not just one person, but like a billion people, and they all do something bad, and it's very hard to get I'm sorry for a billion people and then trust all of them together. So it's enough for one person to not, it's kind of keeps collapsing. So it's very, very hard. One kind of way by which we're trying to deal with it right now is technology. There's kind of system like blockchain and you know, kind of all kinds of anonymous systems that allow you basically to create contracts that have multiple partners that kind of bind each and every person together, and then kind of as a society lift, you know, many people.
And lift, yeah.
And that kind of solves basically the issue of I can trust one person. It's not like to trust a billion by basically making somehow all the billion accountable for each other. And this is a technology solution to making things work. I would say that there's another solution that often works, but I won't recommend it, which is a catastrophe. So historically, when things happened really, really badly for a lot of people, they usually come together and solve it afterwards. I would not recommend that for our world, even though it seems like we're heading there head on right now. But that is a kind of a, you know, there's a silver lining, if you want, from like a lot of bad things, is that usually historically when bad things happen, people kind of shake now and say, okay, what do we do different? So at the very least, like if we're not going to change anything, there's going to be a moment where reckoning afterwards. That's and if you want to take kind of again my brain world and bring it, the brain has billions of 80-something billion entities that all work in isolation in a way, but they all talk to each other. So they connect. Each brain cell is a neuron that cares about its own kind of activity, but also connects to others. And the brain has resolved problems, even though there's what Lincoln used to call a team of rivals in the brain. There are two systems that each think that the decision should be right versus left. And in the end, the brain works it out. And I think that's a mechanism of voting. So the brain basically has a big system to create elections every time a choice is about to happen in rapid speed with all entities participating. So it's, again, like very, very hard to implement worldwide, but it's as if the entire world got to vote every time on every decision, rapid speed, and come together to solve it. And I think that if that was the case in some magical way, then we would see a big shift, because suddenly countries like Bangladesh that right now have big kind of population that suffers, but aren't on the table when it comes to voting on what is going to happen next, will have a vote now suddenly. Suddenly the vote of a person in Montana would be equal to the vote of a person in Bangladesh. And if they get to vote together, then they could actually, you know, rise the planet as a whole. So I'm giving you kind of a very fantastical solution that probably are hard to implement, but I'm saying the technology is already kind of doing something. It's like technology like blockchain is the one I used earlier. They're not just that there are many. They're kind of making it happen. So they allow people to vote on things collectively, and that's one way to do it.
Like coming together and making some level of consensus based on our decision-making processes that are decentralized, so that everybody has the chance to be a participant. I think in terms of the sort of the minimum viable shock, experience that we can almost introduce to people that have varying experiences of the climate changing. So if I'm not sitting in California or if I'm not, at a place that a higher level of climate-related catastrophes are happening, then perhaps I don't believe that it's really happening at all. And so is there potential for these sorts of minimum viable shocks where you get some level of introduction to these potential disasters happening in your life to give you some sort of an awakening or a realization that this could change your behavior, and to believe that this could happen, or to do some research on the potentials, if it does happen, how to be resilient?
So this was a bot question, because you're leading me to the work we're doing right now on climate change that has nothing to do with the brain, and almost it has very little to do with the brain, all about that. So basically, one of the ways by which people can vote collectively on things far, far away is if they kind of put money on events that are somewhere else as like a bet, and they make money if those happen. So for example, I have not been to Thailand in a while, but I know that there are tsunamis happening there every now and then. And those tsunamis both are happening in my life because I read about them in the news, but they also happen in my life because maybe some product I buy, like hard drives, are manufactured in Thailand. And I suddenly in the US cannot get my hard drive because a tsunami destroy the factory that produces my hard drive. So suddenly there's kind of, because of the world of comments, we do get to experience those things. So suddenly, if you can somehow put your money on a company in Thailand that produces hard drives and lose money because of tsunamis there, you become aware. Suddenly you know a lot more. So even if you're in Montana, the tsunami in Thailand suddenly is really kind of affecting your pocket on the spot. So what we are basically creating is kind of a system, and I can elaborate as much as you want on the studies we did, but also on how it works, that basically forces people to somehow put money where the mouth is. So kind of like make bets.
Perception is
far apart. Exactly. And then they lose money if something that that doesn't affect them kind of climate-wise on the spot, but affects them, or weather-wise, I would say, but affects them kind of financially far apart, they start kind of feeling it. And this is a way for our brain to basically create a collective understanding of far things. And I can elaborate more. I just kind of gave a teaser. And if you tell me, I'll speak more about that.
Yeah, totally. I think what's happening here is this relationship between prediction, right? Like knowing, understanding, and seeing the effects of the climate risk basically becomes a model. And what are you predicting according to that? You're putting some money on it, you're betting that this is going to happen. And then there is a sort of response to that as well. So I remember you saying in your research that there are believers, there are deniers, but there are also outliers.
So now I'll dive deep into this study that we ran that kind of is in the very final steps of being evaluated right now. The question we asked is a question: how do you change the mind of a denier to at least consider different opinion? And you can replace, by the way, climate denier, climate believer to Republican Democrat or a liberal conservative. Like the world is kind of broken into binary views, and it's very hard to speak to the other side. It's very hard to kind of make them change. So we said, okay, let's take one that we care about, which is climate change, and see if there's a way to move it. And first of all, when we came to look at it, we realized quickly that nothing worked on the realm of information. So if you take a climate denier and you give them a lot of data, it doesn't change anything. They just find flaws in the data and flaws in you. If you tell them things about kind of how it affects them, things didn't work. What we did see is that there's kind of one or two works that show that money makes a difference. So if people tend to make money or lose money from their beliefs, they start kind of considering them differently. So it's okay, how do we make then climate deniers and believers lose and make money from their beliefs? And if you're kind of a wealthy individual, you already are doing that. So the Koch brothers in the US, who are kind of big sponsors of the climate skeptics group, they tend to lose a lot of money if the world moves from oil to green energy. So they have an invested interest in kind of the world staying in coal, and that's kind of their business interest. So that's fair game. However, for instance, they also invest in tourism. This particular group entity, the Koch brothers group, and it's like I'm picking up on them as good examples of climate deniers. Not that I know that they are climate deniers, but I know that their group kind of sponsor that. So it may or may not kind of reveal their true belief. But the group invests a lot in coal, in oil, and so on. But they also invest a lot of money in tourism. However, they stopped putting money on hotels in Miami. So Miami, the coast, is likely to suffer from water rise in the next couple of years. And despite the fact that if you believe the climate is not changing and it's not happening, and you should definitely invest in hotels in Miami because that's a really good tourism spot, there's a shift away from putting money there because somehow in the back of their mind, they know that this hotel might not get a lot of business in the next 30, 40 years because the water rise is going to affect it. So they kind of divest from things. And this shows us an example of someone who's a climate denier, but acts a climate believer when it comes to their money and somehow kind of behaves like publicly one way, but puts the money differently. So what we created is an experiment where we created what's known as a prediction market, which is basically a stock exchange where people can, instead of invest in companies, they can invest in ideas. So you can come and you can put $10 on...
Like a bet. Just
exactly.
put a bet.
Yeah, you basically say, how likely is it to rain tomorrow? You say, I think it's going to rain. I'm willing to put $10. And if it does rain, you get $10 back plus all the money of the people.
Can they ask a friend or ask an audience?
Anything you want, like as much inside information as you have about the future, you can use. Climatologists, look at the webs, look at anything. You basically have to make a bet on whether it's going to rain tomorrow. Someone else puts a bet as well. And if you say it's not going to rain and they say it will rain, then one of you is going to be right tomorrow, and then you take the money of the other person. So that's kind of what it is. A lot of people
like a team. So you've always got somebody that you're betting with or against.
Yeah. You make something, someone else puts the opposite, one of you is going to win, and they take the money of the other. So it allows us to basically create an easy market. Everyone, no one, we don't have to put our own money. Everyone just puts money, and someone else puts the opposite amount, or the parallel amount of money on the opposite opinion, and one of them is going to win. And it could be weather-related things, like you can bet about tomorrow's rain, or climate-related thing, like will 2021 be the hottest year in history in the Northern Hemisphere, like things that kind of spread over space and time in much longer horizons. And in the end, there's always an outcome, and money is being transacted. And what we saw in this study is, that's the question.
Before you get to the actual outcomes, could you tell us a little bit about the amount of time that they have to actually make that bet? So, for example, if I go on the app or page or whatever, and I see that you've made a bet, and you say that something's going to happen by a certain date, right? How long do I have in response to actually make my counter bet?
So you can choose. So let's say, think about it. You can get in months in advance, and then usually the price is going to be far from being realized. And so you put your money right now, and the price is going to fluctuate a lot, and it's going to get closer and closer as we get to the end date. Or you can join the day before, but then you usually will make less money. So the example would be if you were to make bets on who's going to win the election in the US, Biden or Trump. If you made the bet Biden 3 years ago when he was not a nominee, you would probably say, I'm putting $10. You will find a lot of people who would put money against you, and you will take all their money. If you try to bet that he's going to win 2 days before, you won't find a lot of people who are going to, everyone kind of knows that it's going to happen. So you tend to make less money. So time makes a difference in how much money you're going to make, but you can even vote a second before it materializes. And if you find someone who can kind of go against you, who's willing to go and say, it's not going to happen even 10 seconds before, you will take money from them. So that's kind of, that's how it works. And people do it. People played, and we basically infused the market by selecting in advance people that were self-described deniers and self-described believers, and basically put them in the market and said that we're going to give you money to bet against each other, so they could actually kind of enjoy the battle. And what we saw was that certainly a lot more kind of bets materialized aligned with climate science. Like people, like the climate was real. So people who said it will be the hottest year actually were more correct. But what we found interesting is not that kind of if you bet something that's wrong, you lose money, is that if you bet something you don't really know much about and you win, you actually change your mind. So if you're a climate denier.
I kind of like just pretended, and I was like, something is, I don't know, maybe it's going to be the hottest day of the year. This summer.
You find a way to kind of tell yourself the story, and you make money out of that. Suddenly, it encourages, I think, your mind to change. And this, I think, is to me the important thing. And I will say in one more sentence about that, something that will, I think, be easier to understand to people who are not economists, and for them, the world climate change prediction market together sounds like too many things. It's like the simplest way to think about it. It's a study that was done by a colleague of mine, Troy Campbell. He's in Oregon. He basically brought people that are all climate deniers to the lab. And he basically told them a story along the line of, imagine, he basically asked first one group kind of, how big is the climate problem in the world right now in money? Like how much money would you have to put in order to fix all of it? And people guessed, they had no idea, but let's say they said $1 trillion. Okay, that's the number that, like, we now anchor this number. And then you bring climate deniers. And you tell them, guys, just so you know, the solution to climate change would mean lowering taxes and like things that a lot of people in the US love. You're going to make money, it's going to lower taxes and so on. Now, you ask them, this is the solution. How big is the problem? When the solution is something people like, they said, it's a really big problem. And when he told a different group, the solution is that we're going to take money from you, it's going to raise taxes and so on. How big is the problem? He said, it's a very small problem. So people basically, if they don't know, they don't really use science. They kind of say, how does it affect me? If they like the answer, it's a big problem. If they don't like it, it's a small problem. And I think this is true for not just climate. It's true for a lot of healthcare issues. People come to the doctor, they actually have a disease. The doctor tells them something. If they don't like the outcome, they minimize the symptoms. And this I know as a healthcare person. People kind of underplay their own health to the doctor if they don't like the kind of what they're going to have to do. And this is true for politics. It's true for climate. It's true for healthcare. It's true for money, finances. And I think that's the thing that I wish the audience took away from that, is that there's reality, there's actually symptoms you have, actually how the world is changing, actually the voting, actually, and that's what you want. And it's important to be able to tell them apart and say, what I really want is for this person to be the next chairperson of Germany, okay, the next chancellor. This is who I want. This is what is going to happen. Do I deny reality and say, no, it's not happening, until kind of it's forced on me, and then you have a catastrophe? Or do I find ways to align it? Do I kind of find ways to reconcile reality and my desires, rather than let it basically slap me in the face? And then what it leads to is anger, frustration, hatred of the person who is in the position, hatred of people who supported it. It kind of polarizes us. The best way is to kind of say, okay, I want hotels in Miami. Miami is rising. The water is rising. Do I invest in climate change so I can be in a hotel in Miami, or do I move to a different hotel, or do I kind of say it doesn't happen? Those are solutions that only one of them is actually going to help you. Now I'm going to shut up and let you ask me a question, because I spoke for like 10 minutes in a monologue.
Yeah, no, totally. But I mean, the research that you're doing warrants that. I think that in terms of predicting climate science and allowing people to have a stake in the actual prediction is a stake in the ultimate sort of story of climate science. So whether you do bet or you don't bet, you have a stake in this. And I think that, you know, bringing that to the attention of our audiences is really something quite special. In terms of our audience, I would really like our audience to answer the question, do you have friends who are climate deniers? I feel that this question is a really fascinating opportunity to know what we want and what our reality is. What we want is either the denial or the belief, right? Like either way, whichever spectrum part of that spectrum you are. And then to appreciate that having representation across the entire spectrum is also part of our duty to know the truth of all, right? Like having only those which represent your own, you know, position in the actual spectrum almost reduces your chances of having a fuller picture of what other people's realities are. So I'm quite curious in terms of the audience and what
I agree. I think we picked this question because I think the answer for a lot of people would be no. And I think, you know, England is a bit different than the US, where I think that just the minority of the number of are staggering in the US, and I don't think they're as big in other countries in the world. In the US, it's really half and half. I think in most of the world, it's not. So, but I think you can think about it. So it's definitely true. That's the best way to actually deal with challenges, is to have a person from the other side kind of interact with you. I think Obama said it nice when he was president. He said, if you're tired of hugging people on the internet, try meeting one in person. And I think that would be a good way to deal with it. And I think that you can replace the word climate denier with a conservative if you're a liberal if you're a conservative. I don't know, if you're I mean, I can think of many. If you're a flat earther, try to find a friend who believes that the world is round, and maybe like, you learn something about that, vice versa. So almost on anything, we think to say, of course I can talk to deniers, but I would never talk to a flat earther. That's too much. Like, that's clearly, I say, try. Like, you will, if at the very least, you will kind of you will fine tune your arguments. You will have better way of like phrasing your things. I think that it's really important for everyone, for scientists, to spend time talking to not just kind of audiences who support them, but to the, you know, extreme other opposite audiences, and to have those debates and arguments. And I think that I would even say, counter the argument, willing to change your mind. So not just like, okay, I'm going to convince this person that the world is round, but kind of like say, like, what would I need to hear in order for me to actually consider changing my view? That's tough.
Or to reduce my cognitive bias.
Yeah. I mean, it's very, very tough for us, because our brain is made to, you know, solidify our own thoughts and kind of perpetuate them internally, and structure our ideology around and attitudes around. Like, a lot of things depend on our views being the way they are. If you're a vegetarian, it's not just that you mechanically eat only plants. You have an identity around that. You kind of feel that it kind of explains your morals. It explains, like, you think that a lot of things come with that. And for you to imagine yourself taking this steak and putting it in your mouth feels like it's never going to happen. And the question that I ask is, like, think about that. Like, what would you need to do in order to do that? And I think it's a nice exercise I play a lot with my liberal friends. I'm an academic, so all of my friends are liberals, and they're all on the left. And it's like and I asked them the question that I asked myself occasionally. I said, like, what would the other side need to do that you would not automatically reject? Like, kind of by definition, a lot of times, if it was done by the conservative side, immediately it's bad. Like, if they did, like, okay, why do we not like it? Like, we don't like it, but let's kind of find the reasons why. Like, it's just like a matter of a second to find the argument why that. So, like, the Republicans were in power in the US for 4 years. You're a Democrat. You don't like Republicans. By definition, if they did something, it's bad. Give me 5 things that the Republicans did in the last 5 years that you like. And most of my friends have a hard time finding those. So I say, okay, I have to play the same game. I'm on one side of the map. I try hard to find things I like that the other side did. And then kind of say, okay, I'm a Democrat. What do I like about the Republicans' actions in the last 4 years? And there are many things that I like as a Democrat that the Republicans did. And I have to reconcile my thoughts around that. And that's something that we all should do. And we suggest that climate denier is like a game, but I urge people to play it with anything. And I play it as a Democrat with Republican. I play it as a scientist with science deniers. I play it as I have many identities, and I play all of them every now and then. It's a great game, and it's a really good way to kind of make your brain think differently.
It's kind of like taking a different route when you're driving, right? Like, you're taking, you're exactly. Still driving, your brain is still working, but you're taking a different route to try and figure out what the lay of the land is. And it's a good sort of like story for that. I think in terms of, climate action, one of the areas that is up for debate at the moment is consumerism, and how much consumerism that is mindless and autonomous can actually have an impact that is negative on the depletion tactics of whether known or unknown on the actual planet. So how do we sort of move that autonomous behavior and quick sort of like behavior into the sort of like thinking about laying the lay of the land, rather than just this is, this celebrity says that this is a good product, a number of celebrities that have been hired to or influencers have been paid to basically say this Weller hair care, or I'm not saying anything about Weller. I don't know enough about Weller, but all of these different products and services are good or bad, or that they represent a very particular nudge towards consuming. And so, we as citizens of the planet, indigenous to this planet, almost kind of like fall into this category of behavior that is autonomous. And I wonder, how do you shift from taking a different route on the road to taking a different route when you're purchasing?
So I'll give you 2 answers in quick ones. I'll say, okay, I'm also wearing a hat of a business professor. So for the last 6 years, I've been taking my work and implanting it in business school. So I've been teaching MBA students how the world works from the perspective of neuroscience in the context of business. So in the course of doing that, I worked a lot with a lot of companies that are basically doing the other side of what I'm going to say right now. They're trying to find ways to make you buy more, to make you consume more of their products. That's their business. And they ask me to help them as a scientist. Like what? And I'm a torn on the one hand, kind of wanting the economy to work and wanting to help companies that do great things get it to the world. But on the other hand, trying to kind of mitigate the risk that those companies are not naive to the fact that they have powers that the individuals don't have. So here I'm going to talk to the individuals, and I'm going to kind of go against what I would tell the companies try to do the same thing. There are a lot of companies that are in the business of getting your mind to take, consume, buy things that they want. And they have a lot more power than you. Even though you think that you're kind of strong and very willed on your actions, the reality is that they are much better. Like the big tech companies, they know you so well that they have engineers and engineers whose entire business is knowing you and finding ways to kind of get you to what they want. And I think that the argument that a lot of my students and a lot of people, and even myself for a while, had was, I can control that. So I'm going to create, people tell me I have rules that I turn off my phone at this certain time, and that's how I deal with the attention economy. I'm not slave to my phone. I'm turning it off at 8 p.m. and I don't use. So maybe you can do that, but most of us cannot. And you will tell us if you can do that. You will tell, I can easily turn off my phone, like any addict who says I can easily not smoke for the next 2. The reality is that you will fail. And most do fail. And when you fail, you will find reasons why this particular failure was unique. Normally, you can't. Just this week, you had a lot of work. So you will do the work for those companies yourself. So I would say here, outside of the kind of the answer I gave before, which is catastrophes will help. So if you actually, if something bad happens to you because you were using your phone, let's pick on the phone as like example, or if you buy too much sugary food and you have diabetes, or if you one of the many things that we do to ourselves that actually hurt us, and we find ways to tell ourselves a story. If you do that, it's going to be bad, and you'll find ways to justify why this time it was different. So I would say here, and that's my advice to people, it would be kind of difficult to implement, but realistic, is outsource your thinking to technology. So that's my one-line answer. I think that it seems like we humans are not capable of defending ourselves anymore. We're not good enough. I would say outsource more of technology. And I'll give you an idea. That when you're going to a restaurant and there's just too many tasty things on the menu, it's very hard to resist temptation. And our brain has so many biases. Like if we went to the restaurant 10 times this week and resisted the chocolate pudding, we will give ourselves points for not doing it 10 times. So the 11th time we'll just take the chocolate pudding. So I didn't do it for 10 times. I deserve it now. This is not how it works. One time is bad. It's not like that the one time that you eat the pudding doesn't know that there's 10 times you didn't do it. It's still bad for you. So it doesn't matter that you kind of went and you said no first, no second, no third, no, and then you took it at 10 times. It's the same thing. And that's just an example. Our brain is flawed in that sense, and it's going to happen again and again. If the choice what to eat will be determined by an algorithm, a machine that you feed in information, that actually knows your calorie count, knows your calcium level and so on, and chooses for you, you're much more likely to actually eat healthy, because you will not be kind of aware of this thing. If someone chooses what products to bring to your home that's not you actually get better. If the machine, and machine is like a vague term for a lot of things could be that machine. If a tool controls your calendars and tells you, you say that today you're really, really busy and you can't go to the gym because you have this deadline tomorrow, and the calendar machine says, I actually freed on your calendar 2 hours today for you to go to the gym. I moved the meeting. I automatically sent an email to your colleague saying that you can go to the gym. If you don't go to the gym, it's because you don't want to. You can. If those things start happening, I think that we will actually move back to eating healthier, to exercising more, to spending more time talking to our friends that we kind of easily relate to, sleeping more. I think that this is an example I speak a lot about. Humans are the only animal in nature that delays sleep. All other animals in nature, when they die, they go to sleep. Humans invented this ability to control our own desire to sleep, and we basically are tired, but still sending this one more email or waking up too early to kind of do this work before the board meeting. And that is affecting our health. We are not as healthy as we could because of our own brain. So I think that because we're failing, here I advocate for technology being the solution, which is very kind of paternalistic, but it's maybe the only way to save us right now.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that you would have a system or a structure that makes those decisions on your behalf, you having programmed that yourself. So it's you programmed it, you've decided what you want, and then you want that to reflect with you, right? So technology becomes a mirror that you then use to sort of like, build your reality, rather than that mirror being somebody else's sort of product or service that they want to put in front of you, so that when you look at it, it reflects what you think you need, when actually what you want is something that comes from yourself.
The one sentence way of saying that is that your brain is programmable. And if you don't program it, someone else will.
Right.
So there's a battle on your brain, and you better be the one controlling it.
Completely. And on that note, wow, what a powerful sentence, and what a powerful way to take away the lessons that you've learned from the research that you've done and the work that you've done on hacking, both in terms of technology and banks and systems, to the way that our body responds and reacts, and how we as humans have the opportunity to be able to hack our own brains and decide what it is that we want our lives, and what we do in the time that we have to relate with what we actually really want, rather than what somebody else wants for us.
I agree. I mean, it's actually, I didn't think about it before. It's like a good tagline for our conversation, that your brain is programmable. And it starts with hacking, and it sends basically a message that we all can program our brains, and it's a time to do it, to avoid this catastrophe that I said would be another way of changing it that we don't want.
Yeah, totally. So, we can program our brains, and here's how.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, Moran, thank you so much for your time and the research that you're doing. I'm really excited about your future research, and I'm sure you're going to be sharing it with us. And thank you very much for joining us on Replenish Earth Live.
Pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. So there you have it. That's the last talk of the day. Replenish Earth starts with the idea that we can live in harmony with nature. And ultimately, if we are to protect the global commons, we have to have a stake in it. It's our decision whether we get involved in that or we don't, whether we're programmed or that we program ourselves into the actual equation of the next, 30 years that we can make the biggest impact and give ourselves effectively the second life that we can have if we give ourselves the opportunity not to be controlled, but to understand what our choices are. Today's theme for the Rise to Replenish Challenge is Second Life. And we've introduced this as an activity to make homemade paper. Who knew? Today, I pledge to innovate and give a second life to my waste by reusing, repurposing, and recycling it. We also have an incredible pledge that you can join, and I'm going to share the video, and that's it from us. Thank you all very much, and speak to you tomorrow. At London Climate Action Week, we call upon all Londoners to commit to the People's Pledge and be part of our goal to replenish Earth by 2030. My name is Tia Kansara, and I pledge that my time on Earth will not be to destroy the hopes of the future. My deeds on Earth will not be to deplete our forests. My dreams on Earth will not be at the stake of the planet. They will be to become more mindful and choose consciously. They will be to support and participate in the smallest of acts of replenishing. They will be part of nature, not apart from. I pledge to not just preach, but to start acting today.